Hong Kong police say any commemoration in the city of the Tiananmen Square massacre will be unlawful. Anyone judged as coming to protest in the famed Victoria Park or other locations risks breaking the law. That's the warning. Saturday marks the 33rd anniversary of Beijing's armed crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in the heart of the city in 1989. Many died, many more were injured. Hong Kong was for decades the only place in China where people would remember the victims of the tragedy. Candlelight vigils in Hong Kong's Victoria Park were the norm. But following the passage of Beijing's national security law in 2020, the vigils have been banned. Still, over the past 2 years, people have found a way to protest. Whether that will happen on Saturday remains to be seen. All right, let's get more on this from DW correspondent Phoebe Kong, who is joining us now from Hong Kong. Phoebe, despite the restrictions, do people plan to protest in some way?
Well, over the past year, the Hong Kong government banned the commemorative vigils, citing pandemic restrictions. But even so, we witnessed that some people still try to turn out and defy the police ban with their candles or their cell phones lights on to mourn the victims of the Tiananmen crackdown. But this year, I think the situation will be largely different from last year or before that, mainly because of the huge chilling effects that we're experiencing now in the city. That I don't think we're expecting a significant scale of protest or action on the streets or around Victoria Park. And that's also because the police explicitly warned people that they would risk breaking the law by maybe even going to the Victoria Park on its own, like with others with similar purpose. So this is a kind of warning and try to deter people from showing up at Victoria Park or conduct any kind of action to commemorate the Tiananmen crackdown.
But besides this recent warning, all the signs in the lead up to this have been very ominous, haven't they?
Yes, if we still remember, the Alliance, which was the organizing group of the traditional candlelight vigil over the past 3 decades, throughout 1990 to 2019, and that kind of visual, even though they were banned over the past 2 years, but the organizing group still insisted on applying for such assemblies over the past 2 years. But this year is actually marking the first anniversary ever that there is no one actually applying for such assembly at Victoria Park. So this is a pretty landmark for Hong Kong, particularly for the history of the commemorating the Tiananmen crackdown in Hong Kong. And that kind of chilling effect and the fear that affects people, not only for ordinary people, but also for churches and universities, that those are places in the past relatively safe for people to mourn the victims. But this year, the Catholic churches decided not to hold any kind of commemorative mass, citing safety concerns. Even for those Christian churches going ahead, people told me that they're under tremendous pressure, that they can only organize closed-door prayers.
Right, we'll leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for bringing us this update. DW correspondent Phoebe Kong reporting from Hong Kong. Thanks, Phoebe. The 1989 protests on the very expansive Tiananmen Square in Beijing brought China to a tipping point. Protesters, led mostly by students, wanted reform and democracy. The Communist Party didn't. What followed was an army-led crackdown where tanks and soldiers were used against defenseless students. That was the intervening night between the 3rd and 4th of June. This is how it unfolded.
After weeks of protest, the People's Liberation Army came at night. Thousands of soldiers. They used live rounds and tear gas to disperse the huge gathering in central Beijing. Protesters seeking a different China. There were running battles overnight, and in the early hours of June 4th, tanks and armoured personnel carriers began their attack on Tiananmen Square. The soldiers beat people, shot people, ran people over with tanks. By dawn, the vast concourse was clear. The official death toll was 241, But other estimates believe at least 10,000 people were killed by their own military. The Communist Party has resisted any calls for an investigation into how many perished. It was a brutal conclusion to a dream of democracy that began on Tiananmen Square in April, with students on bicycles calling for reform. By June, around 1 million people from all walks of life had made their way to the heart of the capital. The gathering inspired supporting demonstrations around the country. They were calling for an end to soaring inflation, greater transparency and less corruption. They wanted the chance to elect their own government. For the Communist Party, it was a challenge to its very existence. They labelled the students treacherous bandits and imposed martial law. The world watched as students unveiled the 10-metre-high goddess of democracy, modelled on the Statue of Liberty, in front of the Forbidden City. Days before the massacre, party chief Zhao Ziyang visited the students, accompanied by future Premier Wen Jiabao. Zhao pleaded with the student protesters to leave, but was ignored. He was purged and he lived out his days under house arrest. The day after the massacre, a man stood his ground before a column of advancing tanks on Chang'an Boulevard, which runs directly into Tiananmen Square. Tank Man's solitary act became the defining image of the protests, and one that has blighted the Communist Party's reputation to this day. Every year at this time, the party detains human rights activists and censors discussions of the crackdown. Algorithms scrub any online references to the massacre on China's parallel internet. Overseas, the focus turns to China's repression in Tibet, Xinjiang and Hong Kong. More than 3 decades later, the events on Tiananmen Square in 1989 still resonate.
And joining me now is someone who was there at Tiananmen Square the night of this tragedy, Rose Tang. She was a student leader during the protests and barely escaped with her life during the army's crackdown. She's now based in New York and is an artist, journalist, and activist. Ms. Tang, it's a pleasure to have you on DW News Asia. Thank you so much for your time. How does it make you feel every year when the anniversary of this massacre comes around?
It makes me feel very heavy and heavier than usual, especially we're into the 3rd year of the pandemic. It looks like the dictatorships have been proliferating and getting worse, and humanity and planet Earth have been in a worse situation, have gone down south. I sometimes despair, and I'm also hopeful.
Now, this anniversary is never marked on the Chinese mainland, and now increasingly not in Hong Kong either. Is it only a matter of time, you think, that its memory is wiped clean from China's consciousness?
It's not a matter of time. Think about the Holocaust. The memories are never erased. Not just because of people like me, like you, keep talking about it, not just one day per year. Tiananmen massacre, which I survived, I live in that massacre. The massacre lives inside me every day, anytime. The Chinese government has been haunted for the last 33 years, ever since, and they're so scared. That's why they ban people in China and even Hong Kong from commemorating it, jailing lots of people, especially the people in Hong Kong, people who organized the annual candlelight vigil in Victoria Park. The major leaders are in jail.
I wonder how you look at China now. I mean, is it truly a People's Republic of China when the government is clamping down on its own people by imprisoning them in detention camps, such as in Xinjiang, or cracking down on people's voices for democracy in Hong Kong?
China since 1949 has never been People's Republic of China. It's the country, the regime for the very small number of the Chinese Communist Party. The rich and the powerful has always been like that. Ever since the Chinese Communist Party was established in 1921, They even cracked down on the dissent inside the party, internally, since the very beginning. Has never been the people's country. And not to mention the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and the Mongols who have had their homeland, their countries taken away, occupied, invaded, and colonized ever since. This is about colonization, genocide for decades, which has been unfortunately approved by most powerful countries in the world.
You must agree that China is a very different place from 1989. I mean, it's the second largest economy in the world. It's got a global voice and influence and is challenging the United States as a new superpower. Surely this counts for something. This is something that would make many Chinese proud, wouldn't it?
Why should they be proud of the worst human traits in the world? Why should they be proud of a murderous regime that has committed not just one genocide, but a series of genocides against not just, against not just against the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongols, and Hong Kongers, and also against the Chinese themselves. This is a self-destructive regime, not just self-destructing China and the China-occupied countries, but the world. Nothing to be proud of. This is a very dangerous trend.
Right. We'll leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for joining us today. Rose Tang, journalist, activist, and artist. Thank you so much, ma'am.